Hello everyone, and welcome to Testing Talks Online. We have a very exciting panel discussion for you today called Lifting the Lid on Performance Testing, Best Practices from Leading Companies. This panel discussion topic was inspired by feedback following Testing Talks Conference 2019, where attendees let us know they would like to have seen the addition of a talented performance engineer from a leading company speaking to best practices. Another piece of feedback we received was that our attendees loved our panelists sharing real stories of struggle and how they overcame in our previous Testing Talks Online. Our panelists are excited to take on this feedback today. On that note, I want to introduce our industry-leading performance engineers, Stephen Townshend, Paul McLean, Nicole van der Hoeven, Henrik Rext, and Dylan Lacey. I want to extend a massive thank you to our partners, our two platinum partners, Neotis and Source Labs, our gold partner, Headspin, and our silver partner, Shri. Our partners make this event possible by funding our webinar platform, prizes, and swag, and so I encourage all our attendees to check out their websites and respective offerings. I also want to thank my fellow organisers at Testing Talks, Aswin Gola and Leon Vessel, who are amazing fellow organisers. They helped me so much behind the scenes and are incredible friends and fellow testers of whom I have the privilege to work alongside every day as a tester at Tabcorp. The reason we created Testing Talks Online was to create a fun and amazing events with our awesome testing community. Industry-leading testers as speakers, incredible prizes, delicious catering, fun and games. With the pandemic, this has made running such events tough, but we hope Testing Talks Online can fill the gap and provide some added joy for our community until we can come back together in the future, bigger, better than ever before. Thanks to our incredible partners, we have 6 awesome prizes up for grabs for our attendees today, including a $200 Amazon gift card, a $100 JB Hi-Fi gift card, a Rise Tello drone, Pioneer Bluetooth headphones, a $200 JB Hi-Fi gift card, and some Apple AirPods with charging case. One of our great prizes can be won by navigating to the following link provided by Headspin and filling in a brief survey. I will put this link in chat now in Zoom. I'm just going to select all panelists and attendees. And you should see that now in chat. It's usually bottom right for people that are using perhaps Zoom for the first time or haven't actually used chat before. It only takes about 2 or 3 minutes to fill in, and it's super appreciated from our partner Headspin. And that's also how you can go in for the chance to win that $100 gift card. The 5 other amazing prizes can be won by getting in the top 5 scores on our Testing Talks Online game, which can be found on the Testing Talks website, which I'll link now. Finally, we have some awesome swag packs available thanks to our platinum partner, Source Labs. Please fill in this survey from Source Labs in order to go into the draw to win one of these swag packs, which will be delivered by mail. They're super cool, and the shirt is really cool. I often see these shirts outside of conferences. I think that's a sign of a good conference or event shirt is when they're cool enough to wear not at an event or conference. And they got like test all the things in like code formatting on the shirt. So it's pretty cool for anyone that wants to kind of nerd out with their testing. All right, moving on. We encourage all our attendees to use the chat feature in Zoom to leave us any questions you would like our panel to address. We will address these questions throughout Testing Talks Online. So feel free to just literally put those questions straight into chat to our panelists and we'll go to them as soon as we can. We don't have to have a Q&A at the end, we'll just hit them when we can. We will draw the survey game prizes after the Q&A and you will hear from our platinum partners Source Labs and gold partner Headspin on who has won the other prizes. Once again, thanks for joining us today. Let's kick off our panel discussion on lifting the lid on performance testing, best practices from leading companies. To get started, we thought it might be fun to tie in an introduction for everyone with a disaster story from our time either working in performance testing or around it. And I'm going to start with Stephen Townshend. Stephen?
Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Townshend and I'm a performance specialist based in Auckland in New Zealand. I've been doing performance testing for the last 12 or so years. My disaster story is I was performance testing a large application for a government department. As a side thing, there was a process of they were going through to enrich the customer data by improving the address. So what they needed to do is go into the application, and there were 100,000 or so customers. They needed to hit a button and the address would get enriched or updated. And so they wanted to automate this process. And they asked me, can you use your performance testing scripts to do this thing in production? And I said, no, this is a really bad idea. I could do it, but it's going to be a disaster. And they said, no, do it. So anyway, I made sure they knew the risks and said, do you accept the risk? And they said, yes. And I went ahead, I ran the script, and it was all fine. And then a few hours later, someone noticed that every single customer record in production had a note against them with the word boom, just boom, because I had put that in as a debug thing to check that the record would be updated, and I forgot to remove it. So of course they had to they had to back out my change, restore the database, and they said, let's not do that again. So that's my story.
Nicole? Nicole, you're on mute.
Oops, sorry about that. After all the practice. Hi, everyone. I'm Nicole Vanderhoeven. I am a performance engineering consultant working at Tricentis Flood, and I've been in performance testing for about 8 years. So my disaster story is that I was working on this project. I had just entered like halfway through the performance testing, so it was like we had a lot of deadlines. And the functionality that we were testing was creating and sending out these letters to customers. And we spent so much time tuning the relevant systems, and we really got it humming actually. And we more than met the requirement of like letters sent per hour, only to find out that these letters apparently had some content in them that caused customers to be quite angry and call the company's customer support line. And unfortunately, that wasn't equipped to handle the increased number of letters. So what we actually had to do was introduce an artificial bottleneck to kind of stagger how quickly these letters were generated. And I think that that's just a really, well, a good or a bad example of us focusing too much on the technological aspects of an application and kind of forgetting about the human factors, which can be even more important.
Absolutely. Paul?
So my name is Paul McLean. I've been doing load testing since 1999. I work for my own company, RPM Solutions, and I've been getting into test data and advocating for better test data. So I set up test data services. My horror story, I've been trying to figure which one will I talk about based on who's said what already. I think the worst one that I've been involved in is when I've had to run a test, or I ran a particular test and it involved email. And unfortunately, even though I checked and double checked that there is no way on earth that this email, that the outbound email was going to in any way impact on production. And they said, definitely no way at all. It's isolated to a separate email system. So I set up the test, ran the test, and then we found out that it was a separate email system, but that separate email system effectively generated dodgy emails that got bounced internally, but the internal bounce process went to a real email. So then the bounces got handled as real emails, and it caused all sorts of problems. And it basically took a large production email system that served tens of thousands of users offline for 2 days. So that was bad. So even when it looks like you're not connected to production, a side effect, an unexpected outcome of what you're doing might be connected to production. So that was my horror story.
Henrik?
Hi, my name is Henrik Rexhat, so I work for Neotis. Currently I'm the performance archaeologist. So I'm I'm trying to bring all dinosaurs to Earth in a few days. You will see that. So my horror stories, I have a lot of horror stories, but I think I'm gonna pick one that's quite aligned with the one that has been selected so far. So it's a project where I was working for a French insurance company, and they had this app where you can basically print out your contract. And in France, or at least in Europe, you have to put your contract visible in your car. So we call it the green card. So they basically, the French insurance company decided to outsource their printings of their green cards. So we had to test that. And when we tested this, we asked gently the project to make sure that there was no link going to the third-party company that was going to print out all the orders that we're going to generate on their websites. So we ran a bunch of tests. And of course, we decided to have an address look similar to the location of the office. And we generated, I don't know, millions of different orders. So we did that test on, I don't know, it was Thursday or something. And then the weekend comes back, you're happy, and you arrive Monday morning with a lot of energy, and you arrive in the office, and suddenly you see, I don't know, a line of trucks in front of the main building of your customer, and everyone is looking at you and say, "Hey, this is your orders." I say, "What? What are you talking about?" "Yeah, I don't know. There is a bunch of green cards that you have ordered. So could you sign here?" I say, "No way. I'm not going to sign this. This is your fault." So basically, there was this very famous ping pong game where you say, "It's not my fault. It's yours." You know that one. So that was a quite funny situation, to be honest. A Monday morning, justifying why you ordered so much things and who is going to pay that for that.
Wow. Yeah. Dylan?
G'day, everybody. My name's Dylan. I'm currently the manager of developer relations at Source Labs. Way back in the start of my career, I started doing load testing with Selenium, which is embarrassing enough. But I'm actually, before I was the manager of developer relations, I was a customer support engineer at Source. So I'm going to steal a customer's story. It doesn't have the kind of terrible real-world impact that the fellow panelists had, but it did waste a company that definitely wasn't a US financial company an awful lot of money. They just started using front-end performance testing. And they decided that unless their page had a certain kind of responsivity, no tests could go out. So no changes could go out. So they did their functional tests, they did their performance tests, and unless the performance test passed, they couldn't deploy that code. And their performance tests weren't passing. So they spent 2 and a bit weeks trying to get their performance tests to pass, then blaming us for them not passing, doing everything they could to make their site more responsive, load better, disabling features. And what we found out eventually was they had taken some of the resources that their site needed, and they deployed those to a content distribution network, which is pretty typical. But they'd only done that for some of the resources for their like pre-flight staging system. And because the system was internal, they had a VPN connecting our infrastructure with their infrastructure. And that VPN couldn't reach the internet in a reasonable way. It went through a few dozen proxies and a VPN backwards and forwards. And that was the problem. They had configured it so that like basically fonts would take 20 seconds to load because the network connection for the font was pinging all over the internet and backwards and forwards. And all they had to do to make their tests pass again after like wasting all this engineer time was just update one little config line to say, hey, don't send the CDN through the VPN. Just, it can go straight to the internet. That's what it's for.
Yeah. So for those that don't know me, my name's Cameron Bradley. As well as being the organizer of testing talks, I work as a QA. So I'm the QA practice lead for lotteries and Keno at Tabcorp. When it comes to testing, I definitely have 2 major passions, leading a team and all that goes with that. So, skilling up team members, finding the right talent, delivering on our outcomes, which is obviously delivering quality to our systems and our customers. But second, the ones that work really closely with me, my biggest passion for testing is in automation. I love creating frameworks from scratch, working across all platforms, be it iOS, Android, core systems, as well as API and web. And I'm always working with the team on new frameworks. For example, right now we're actually working on a really cool Cucumber Espresso Kotlin automation framework for Android, which is producing some really cool results. And I'm actually looking forward to talking about that soon. As far as performance engineering, I've obviously been fortunate to work very closely with the performance engineers in various companies. One of the worst issues I ever saw was basically they prepared a massive onslaught, basically a massive load test for basically verifying that all the customers can complete the required transactions for a big day. Unfortunately, they went to test this and they weren't pointing at production. So they weren't pointing those performance tests at an actual, I guess you could say, test environment. They were actually on production, and they took out production. So they took down production about a week or two out from a massive day in the calendar. Needless to say, they had very white faces for about 3 or 4 days. They were pretty much scared for their life around the company. Everyone knew that they'd made this mistake. They were very open and honest with it. They definitely did not mean it. And they worked incredibly hard to restore their reputation afterwards, and have never done it again since. And that was about 3 years ago. That's probably the worst I've seen. Moving on. So we're going to start with what is performance testing. So because we have a very unique audience, we have junior QAs here, we have senior QAs, we have lead QAs, we have performance engineers, we have software engineers, based on all the titles of those in this session. We decided we have to sort of start from square one, and that is to just answer that question, what is performance testing? And a way that we discussed together we could approach that is to actually look at what is the actual business case for performance testing, or why does it even exist? And I thought I'd start with Stephen Townshend on this one.
Yeah, I think to answer that question, first of all, you have to think about what is performance, because then you can think what performance testing is. And the best definition I've come across so far is that it's really 3 or maybe 4 things, roundly speaking. One is response time. So how fast does the software go? And that could be anything from how long your customer experience is, how quick hitting a button on a web page is, but it could also be how long does a batch job take, everything like that. The second one is capacity. How much stuff can our software systems cope with? So that's the second thing. So that's around growth and projections and handling events. Stability, the other one, do our systems continue to behave themselves over prolonged periods of use? And an increasing one in the cloud world is actually cost. Cost becomes a performance metric. So with those things in mind, the business case becomes around for me, performance risk is business risk. So what is the business risk? And in an oversimplified way, I think it's about the productivity of our business, about the revenue of the organizations we work for. It's about our customer, our reputation, our brand reputation as well. And in the worst case scenario, if in some industries, human well-being, particularly in say the medical industry or aeronautics, a performance issue could put someone's life at risk, right? So that's a worst case scenario. So that's kind of the business case, is avoiding those things from happening.
Absolutely. And I guess tying into that, what is the difference then between performance testing and load testing? And I'm going to go to Nicole for this one.
So I think that these are terms that a lot of people confuse. Performance testing isn't the same thing as load testing. Performance testing encompasses load testing, and load is one way that you can test the performance. But performance testing also includes things like front-end performance testing and a lot of database optimizations. And all of these things kind of take a back seat to load testing, because load testing is like the one that gets all the attention, unfortunately. So I think it's really important when you want to performance test an application that you look at all aspects of performance, back end, front end, as well as other non-functional areas that you can test as well.
Absolutely. It's interesting. I find a lot of QAs when they join Tabcorp, they actually believe, and it's because they haven't really worked in performance, that they believe the majority of performance tests are actually done through the browser. I guess I want to ask Paul, does performance testing happen through the browser, through the API, the protocol? How does it happen?
I think that depends on how the service is consumed. So if your users using your app are using a browser and it's got stacks of Ajax on there, stacks of different requests, I think there's no substitute for doing a performance test with a real browser, because timers go off that trigger certain things. If you're typing into a field and you leave a 100 millisecond versus 101 millisecond gap, an extra request will go out to autocomplete, for example. So all that comes into the way that the the front end is designed, and that affects the way it performs. It also affects the workload on the back end, which affects the performance, you know, under load. So I would say that most of the time you need a browser to be able to test the end user experience, because the end user uses a browser. If, however, you're using apps like a mobile app, and the mobile app hardly does anything except formulate the request, ship it off and wait for the response, and then quickly represent the response, then you don't need a browser for that. A simple HTTP style, API style test would be fine. But I would think very often for end user oriented apps, you really do need to use a browser for performance testing, because that's the way that a user sees it.
Right. Let me provide an example. So Nicole, just before this session, mentioned, asked about the up ramp we're having at Tabcorp for Melbourne Cup and the Spring Carnival, which is very close. So I guess if I'm asking you, you know, based on what you just said, but moving into the next step, with performance testing, what are we trying to measure? And where do we provide value for, say, Tabcorp coming up to the Melbourne Cup? I'm going to cross to Henrik for this one.
So I think what you want to measure really depends on your project, your application. Again, if I am a retailer with a website or a mobile app, then of course I will pay a lot of attention on the user experience, the response times of the app itself. But then the performance testing, like Stephen explained, impact the business, the brand, maybe having some discussion with business. There are a few metrics that make sense for the business. So trying to collect those requirements and measure as well side of the traditional response time that you may measure traditionally in performance testing. You can also sort of calculate those indicators as well. But again, I think performance is not only about response times. I mean, as Stephen explained it, now it's also about costs. So what you measure, I think there is plenty of various indicators that you have to measure to properly evaluate the performance. Performance is not about is the response times under 3 seconds or not. No, it's about response times. It's about how your infrastructure behave on the hosts, on the servers, on the application server, on the network. So there is so many different indicators that you should consider and measure to properly evaluate performance. So yes, of course, there are a lot of response times type of indicators that we are going to measure naturally. But I think you also have to ask yourself what makes sense from organization. What are the indicators that would make sense so I can make the right decisions? So I think measurement is almost slightly aligned with the contexts, the project, and the organization where we are working on with.
Henrik?
I'd just like to add to that sometimes for certain types of users, what the user is caring about is not response time. So if you're doing an internal app, like let's say someone's using SAP or they're using, I don't know, some CRM system or something, they may not care how long it takes for the whole page to get back for a particular page. They may only use that page as a stepping stone to get to another page. So for them, the response time might be, when can I click on something to take me to the next page? And some of them type ahead, you know, they use special keys. So they don't even care about that. And if we take too much of a rule-based approach to load testing, we might think every page needs to be measured in its entirety from first byte to last byte. But in real life, some users don't care about that. They just want to know, when can I get to the next page? So really for important tests, you really need to find out, what do the users who are using the system care about here? Do they want the last bit? Also, if you're testing for advertisers, they care about the ad popping up, right? Like the whole purpose, the funding for the site's based on the ad being there. If the ad takes 3 seconds to get there, they don't care that the page showed in 1 second. That's just my extra thoughts.
No, absolutely agree, Paul. Dylan, I want to ask you, for your interpretation of this from a front-end performance perspective, and also maybe get you to explain a bit more about what is response time for our attendees.
Sure. interestingly, those are kind of the same answer. With front-end performance testing, and this kind of really goes back to when we were discussing, like, when Paul was discussing how you have to use a browser because a user uses a browser. Especially nowadays, a lot of web apps are built to take processing out of the backend system and move it to the front-end system. So you send a slug of data to the browser, and it constructs the pages on demand. And so with loading pages, you end up with different kind of metrics. Like a big one is, people think, well, when it's loaded is when it shows me something, but that's actually generally called time to first contentful paint. First time the page puts something on there, but it might not accept data yet. So you might actually be wanting to measure time to first interactive, which is when you can start typing with the page. And then there's, what's it called? It has an acronym that's just slipped my mind, but when the page lets you interact with it fluidly. So it really depends kind of what impression you're looking for. If you just want the user to know that something's happening, you might just want a small time to first paint, because once the page starts painting, it feels like it's responded. So I guess you're right, we kind of do need to define response time. And it really is just the amount of time it takes between an action being initiated by whatever perceives it, so the user, and when they think that action has finished. It doesn't actually mean the action has finished. It's when they think it's finished. That's the only thing that actually matters. And thankfully, those do tie into those different metrics, like time to first paint, time to meaningful paint. But they aren't quite the same thing. So you do have to be careful that you don't trick yourself into going, oh, well, this metric's really low and that's great. It doesn't actually mean that that's the experience of a user, but we've decided it does. Yeah.
Well put, Dylan. One thing I would say is I want to put someone in a scenario. I think Paul will be great for this. So I'm a hiring manager. I currently work for a large-scale company that deals in millions of transactions per day. And I don't have a performance team. I don't even really know what performance testing is. Maybe I've just read the basics on Google. And I ask you, why do we need performance testing? What do you say to that, Paul? Paul, you're on mute, bud.
Thanks. I would go back to what you said originally in your intro, which is when at an organization you worked at, someone pointed a load test at prod and it killed prod. So that is actually a great demonstration of the effectiveness and the power of a load test. It's enough to do as much, if not more, than a population of real users will do. But the difference between load testing and an onslaught of real user activity is that you can control it and you can stop it whenever you like. When your production system is being smashed, you can't ring someone up and say, hey, Paul, stop the test. Our system's smoking or whatever. You can't do that. It's production. So it gives you the ability, load testing gives you the ability to simulate situations that you have control over and that allow you to be able to replicate and root cause analysis and resolve issues that would otherwise devastate a production environment, and make it so you've got a viable app at the end of the day that can handle that workload. So I'd say it's all about resilience, reliability, and ongoing performance.
Absolutely, Paul. We've just had a great question come in. We're getting quite a few, but I'm trying to put them in a place of where they kind of fit as far as the discussion overall, because some are quite technical. But we've had a great one from D. Martin, and I just want to cross to perhaps Nicole, if she's interested in this one. Advice for a QA wanting to learn performance testing and build cases for implementation in the business. Where to start? Tool selection. What is the panelist journey in this space?
I think that the best way to start is with the why, because I think that there's a lot of focus on how to implement something or, what load testing tool to use. But people sometimes forget to ask themselves whether they should even do performance testing or why they're doing it. There are cases where you shouldn't do load testing. And I think that there are some resources on this front. It depends also whether you want to go into front end or back end. I think there are a lot of books like Steve Sauter's High Performance Websites was something that I used as an introduction into performance testing, because I also came into it from a QA side of it. And I think that there's a lot of open source tools right now that would be a great way to kind of get your feet wet. A lot of the commercial ones also have like a free community trial too, if you want to get into the actual load testing tool part of it.
Thanks, Nicole. Stephen, curious for your views on this one as well.
I do agree that it's about figuring out the why first, but at some level, like when I hire a grad and they need to pick up performance testing from the beginning, I actually start off and just say learn JMeter, learn a tool, because that gives you the confidence to, and just by going through that process of learning the tool, you get confronted with things like truly understanding HTTP protocol, how to design a test, and how to get meaningful results out of it, and to start reading those results. And then once they have that context, then I start overwhelming them with the big picture and the context of why they're doing what they're doing. If you try and, I've tried in the past to teach performance testing from a big picture first, and it just didn't work. So there's definitely some merit to just picking up a tool and getting good at it. Yeah, other side of the coin.
Absolutely, Steve. We also had a question from Evelyn around sort of any recommendations on pathways to getting into automation. And I thought I'd have a quick crack at that one. And for me personally, I think for both software engineering and automation, especially coming at it from a tester, the best way is to just do side projects, to basically go online, learn what the sort of innovative frameworks are, whether they're Espresso for Android or XCUI Test for iOS or Protractor for Angular, or even Cypress for React and Angular or JavaScript client applications in general. Look up what these are, ask questions, come to events like this, and then actually go out and just have a crack at building your own frameworks outside of work. Because I honestly think as much as it's sort of like, oh, well, I'm not exactly getting paid for it, it's sort of an investment in your own self-development. And even just creating projects, you could create a small website, maybe for a family friend, and you automate it. Even testing talks, the website that you guys all registered through, I've added about 385 automation tests for that. And I built that whole site with Ruby. And I did that because I thought it'd be cool to learn Ruby. And I thought it'd be cool to learn a few different frameworks that I'd never used. And it's proved very beneficial. Just as a bit of a laugh as well, I do apologize for sending everyone 3 emails before the event. It's a great example of something I didn't automate properly or enough. And I definitely didn't performance test in production. So you saw an issue right there. So that should have been 1 email you will receive, and I'm very sorry for that. Moving down to the next theme though, I want to cross over to customer perception. Something we all see on LinkedIn is these stories, these crazy stories about, the World Cup website going down the day of the World Cup, the opener, because they didn't, interpret all these people hitting the website at once. I want to cross to Henrik and ask him about, how important customer perception is and why we performance test.
I mean, it's a key question. I think when you do deliver, when you're spending a lot of time building a release, and you go to production and you realize that nobody's able to use your product because of a bad performance, then it's going to be a shame. So definitely you need to have to measure the customer perceptions. There are different way of doing it, of course, today. So it really depends of the type of metrics that you could follow. So there are, for example, if you look at, you can also monitor the social networks, and there are organizations that do that, collecting after production, see if there is any complaints, if there is anyone, basically going to your people in charge of all the social networks things, just to monitor and see how if the customer doesn't react from our latest release. I think from the past we didn't much consider customer perceptions. We were more or less focused on, let's have a good response time between 2 or 3 seconds, and even this, 2 or 3 seconds. We did a survey recently, and we asked 515 people, companies from various industries, say, hey, what do you tolerate in terms of response times? And it's funny is that I think when you're working within a project, your expectation becomes, I don't know, less strict. Okay, so it's my app. I tolerate for sure 4-6 seconds. Yeah, for sure. But then if I am a customer, probably I'm going to, I don't know, Amazon or whatever websites. If it doesn't load in 2 seconds, say, what is, it's unacceptable. So I think there is the perceptions also. I think it's completely change in which chair you're sitting in. And I think it seems so is that a lot of people doesn't treat their customer as they will treat themselves as a customer. I think that's a big problem. I think defining the expectation of the real customers and not the fake customers is something that definitely needs to be done, and follow them on day-to-day basis for sure.
Absolutely, Henrik. Dylan, let me ask you, mate. I mean, we've talked about the customer. What's the possible impacts on the business from not having your performance testing in order?
Money, like lots and lots of money. Sorry, I seem really keen to answer that because the stats are really quite interesting. I may have even written some of them down, especially for front end. I'm going to say that a lot because that's the most of the thing that I do. There've been studies on those different metrics I was talking about, and they're things like a 1.1%. You decrease your homepage load by 100 milliseconds, and that gives you a 1.1% increase in session-based conversion. So that's a session is the amount, like when somebody coming to your web page and just using it until they leave. They got 1.1% extra people signing up, which doesn't sound like much. For one client, Mobify, it may of this research, not a source, it made them $400,000 US. Another one of the examples used in some of the research I've looked at, they decreased their checkout page load speed by 100 milliseconds, which is a tenth of a second, and an amount of time I couldn't actually perceive. They made an additional 530K from that. And there's so much data showing that lowering just tiny little bits of time increases the amount of people that finish buying your product. That's probably the most compelling business case I can make, besides just looking and feeling great. Like Henrik touched on, that customers expect these kind of things. Yeah, money.
Absolutely. Paul, I'm curious for your thoughts on this as well.
So following on from what Dylan said, the average in that checkout might have reduced by 100 milliseconds. But what I suspect happened is that the improvement reduced the number of much slower response times. So there was probably, a nasty trail off on responses. So you don't have to improve the median, which is maybe not noticeable to the human eye. But if you take a bunch of the transactions that would have been 3 seconds and you make them 1.5 seconds, while the average may be still close to 1 second, that's where you really save. So that 1% change in conversion early on might have been from the 10% of people who had a pretty ordinary experience. So I think it's very important to look at the response time distribution. It's a graph that performance engineers do look at, but it takes a while to get your head around what it is and what it looks like. But to make it so most response times are in a tight bunch is really important. And the cost impact of that, the business impact, is not in the mean or median. It's in the outliers.
Yep, that's another reason it's important to do real user modeling, real user monitoring, RUM. It's often referred to as, which is great for making puns about it. But yeah, actually watching what happened to a real user and whether they checked out or not is really important to make sure your performance testing is doing something for you.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Dylan. And we just had a great comment from Pankaj. Number one thing is getting a good mentor and then having that learning attitude. Performance testing is just amazing. You learn every single day on live projects, and there is always something new happening around. Totally agree. And Nicole kind of backed up those thoughts as well around a question earlier around how you can sort of get into performance engineering. Moving on, I guess, fast feedback. We're always talking about it in the sort of QA and automation space as well, like how quickly we can find problems and actually give that feedback back to the business in as fast a way as possible so we can ensure there's actually not a problem in production. I want to cross over to Steve on this and ask, how important is fast feedback in performance engineering?
I think it's incredibly important. I mean, the traditional old school waterfall approach, which is hopefully dying out now, was that we'd run a big program of work. It might take a year and a half, and 2 weeks before go live, they say, oh, we need performance testing. And you run a test. And there are a lot of performance issues you can't just solve by just throwing hardware at it or doing something simple. You have to completely redesign everything. But you spend a year and a half. There's no way that's going to happen. So if you can find that information out from the beginning or near the beginning, you actually have the opportunity to redesign or re-architect parts of the solution and have a much better performance outcome, for sure.
Absolutely.
Just to add to that, I think it's to add to what Steven mentioned, is I think it's super important to monitor. And then people usually just have in mind monitoring their production by applying synthetic monitoring or real user monitoring to understand how users are utilizing systems. But I think it's also important to monitor the entire different stages, so dev, staging, production, pre-prod. So then you're able to compare properly, and you can adjust how you're testing. And I think people agree to invest in monitor production, but it's very hard to convince them to say, hey, now maybe you should also do the shift left and implement what you've done here in production, also in the other environments. So we can also take advantage of those great metrics that you're collecting.
Yeah, and also for the fast feedback, I think there's a tendency of most people to wait until the app's got a decent amount of functionality. But I'll always pester whoever I'm working for to let me access to even the login page. If nothing else is working, just give me the login. Because quite often, if you don't, you wait for a few screens to be ready, and then you find out the login had a problem. And you could have told them that 2 weeks earlier. So fast feedback also includes testing as soon as you possibly can and giving as much feedback while the devs are working on that particular thing.
Thanks, Paul.
And also on that note, I also think that a lot of people think load testing as something that happens at the end of like a cycle, and there's value in that, having peak load tests and that, but I think that where we really undervalue the smaller load tests that are incorporated into a CI/CD pipeline, where you run these like incremental load tests as a new software build is released, the performance tests are automatically run. That gives you like a lot more data points rather than just one big hit at the very end of the performance testing of the testing cycle.
It's true.
Absolutely, Nicole. I'm going to throw this one to the panel, just sort of have a go at it if you like it. So do you think in agile teams, shift left performance testing would be optimal? Anyone with thoughts on that one?
I think it's mandatory.
Yeah.
So testing from the dev, doing the same tests with the same load to be able to compare and detect regressions is the basics. Testing very simple things as early as possible to make sure that, I don't know, any changes or commit made by someone has impacted our baseline or our requirements. That is crucial. Of course, then I think doing the integration, where you start integrating your components together and testing them as well, is also highly important, because you usually introduce a lot of performance problems from the moment you connect components, introducing latency between those components. So I think that integration testing, performance testing in the integration environment is also super important. And of course, the traditional way that we just described with the browser and mobile device is important. But I think from an agile perspective, if you're going on that direction, making sure that you're testing the main components API on a daily basis is, I think, the first step to moving on to performance automation or continuous performance automation.
But in addition to that, shifting left is not much good if there's no data in the database of the app. So it's important that whatever you're going to shift left and do, that you have enough data in there. So I would advocate for, if it's an online store type app and you're doing, I don't know, fulfillment with a warehouse or something, that the actual test not be a 3-minute test, that just does 100 orders in like 10 seconds, but it actually signs up 1,000 users and does, you know, several tens of thousands of orders and does a bunch of things so that you actually see if there's any degradation with a buildup of data, because that's often missing from those shift left type tests, especially in CI/CD pipelines.
I think especially with greenfield development, it's mandatory because it directly informs the architecture of what you're building. Because you might discover like, hey, the way we're loading this data is so slow, we just can't do it that way. This page that's meant to show everything cannot show everything.
Right.
We must break it up into panels, or we must do infinite scroll. And if you learn that after you've implemented that component, all that work is wasted. You have to do it again. Yeah.
Even like things like controls for seeing how names show up and realizing, my gosh, if we have a lot of names in this list, it's impossible to find the right person. All those sorts of usability things. I know they're not strictly performance, but when you actually, for the first time, inject decent volumes of data into your system and try and run a test, as a side effect, you often get exposure to those other issues. So shift left is great as long as you've got lots of data in there.
I just want to argue with one thing, Paul. I think
Yes,
they are
please.
performance issues, because I think performance issues in a lot of ways anything the user perceives, and maybe that's annoying because you can't measure it. Okay, no, that is annoying because you can't measure it. But like in a real world context, honestly, doesn't matter what the number is. It matters whether the number represents what the user thinks. Just
So-
a different way of looking at it.
Yeah, nice.
I think my problem with shift left is that it can kind of feel or it comes across as something that's binary. Either you shift left or you shift right, when the reality is you should be doing testing throughout all phases of development. I think there is a case, and I agree with everything that everyone has said about shifting left and doing it earlier on, but there's also a case for testing in production because, I mean, everyone already has a production-like environment, and that's production. And people forget that.
I think, yeah, but that's going testing in production. There's a lot you can do if you're releasing really small batches through like a DevOps or continuous sort of delivery type model. But if you're releasing massive chunks of functionality every 3 months, then it's much more difficult to do.
Yeah,
Not only does
I
everyone
would
have
definitely agree.
not only does everyone have a production-like environment called production, none of their other environments are production, no matter how hard you try to make them, because all of your users are synthetic. You're probably not deploying on the same scale.
Yep. But you know, it's funny. There's a big pushback to the phrase "test in production." But how do we give licenses to young people? We test them on production roads. Like that's the example, and that's life and death, right? We put an 18-year-old behind a wheel and we let him drive at 80 or 100 kilometers an hour on a highway. That's testing in production, and then we actually do it. So sometimes our caution is so high that we don't take, I think, reasonable risks. And I think there's a different place for testing in production. That's my 2 bobs worth, even load testing.
And I think testing in production requires a lot of maturity and a lot of methodology behind. You don't improvise when you do load in production. You have clear methods. You don't do transaction that will write in your database. I mean, you can do an application. I can give you my bank account, and you can do a lot of transfer funds to my account. I will be very happy to do that for sure. But yeah, of course, if you start writing things in database, make sure that you have to unplug the database. So there's a lot of things behind. So behind just doing performance testing in production. And I mean, now I think people has slightly changed the terminology of load testing in production. People is more thinking about, I'm going to do some sort of synthetic monitoring that I have done in various environment dev. I started to do that approach of synthetic measuring some key scenarios automatically on daily basis in dev or staging in pre-prod, and then I redo that in production. So that will just confirm that what I've been measuring on the entire project lifecycle and all those different various environments, I'm still on a line and I'm not having something weird. So I think, yeah, again, don't improvise in production. There is a lot of horror story. We discussed about it with Paul just before. Remember Chernobyl?
Yep.
It's a real story. They were testing in production, guys. So don't explode anything in your environment. That will be very dangerous.
This is kind of touching on something I noticed a lot when doing support. Is we have these organizations who are customers who it's really challenging for me to work with them, not because of them, but because the quality management team is separate from the dev team, so they have to really like fight to get the dev team to work with them. And I think that's problematic because it's really critical that as quality professionals we're able to speak with the developers and like help work with the architects so we can do things like Henrik said, so we can go, hey, we can test in production because we've thought about it and we've got like, we can set a specific mode for production that doesn't do the credit card transaction or does everything except do the financial bit. But you can only do that if you have a good relationship with, if you are either are embedded in the dev team, you are the dev team, or you have a decent relationship and they're treating you as like a center of excellence.
Let's move on to our next key point. I think, I mean, we've kind of talked to sort of the what, then we talked a bit about the why. I guess I just want to understand now, what's actually involved in creating a good performance test. How do we make a load test realistic? And I want to start with Stephen.
I think I've got quite a few points. I've taken some notes here. One of them is understanding the business context first. And part of that as well is having an understanding of the workload, the expected workload. Because you need to understand, what am I going to test? How do you make that decision? Is it going to be the stuff which we expect to have high volumes of activity or load on? Is it the stuff which is business critical? Is it the stuff which maybe has an existing performance issue? You need to sort of analyze that with the business context and prioritize it. And another thing I mean by business context is I'm performance testing an application at the moment. And there's two channels into the application. There's the call center and there's digital customers. And although they do the exact same business, under the covers, they do very different technical things and have a totally different performance footprint on the application. So you need to understand that before you begin. Otherwise, you might completely miss something which is going to cause disasters in production. I don't want to hog the limelight because I'm sure other people have opinions here, but another thing which is really important is to run tests for the right duration. So there's especially if you're doing continuous delivery and you've got a pipeline, you might be tempted to quickly shove in a 5-minute performance test and go, we're done. But that's going to miss a lot of things. So the first thing is, are you capturing enough measurements or samples to have meaningful confidence in what you're observing and the things you glean from that? That's the first thing. But the second thing is, many performance issues happen over large timescales. So what if there's a thing where your website freezes for 5 minutes once an hour? If you run a 5-minute test, you may never see that issue until you run a test for a couple of hours. And things might degrade over time, but you're not going to see that with a 5-minute test. It might take 72 hours for it to fall apart. So running a test for the right duration is important as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to every panelist on this one because I'm just so keen to hear from everyone. Nicole?
Yeah, I think workload modeling is one of the areas where people get stuck on a lot because I think it's just too easy to think of things in terms of number of users, which is really ambiguous because what are those users doing? So let's take the example of Melbourne Cup. I didn't know this because I had never bet before, but when I did test the Melbourne Cup previously, I had to learn a whole bunch of industry terminology, like what is a fixed odds bet versus a pari-mutuel bet. That might not seem like something that you would have to care about as a performance tester, but they go to completely different systems, are calculated differently, pay out differently. I mean, it's important to think about what you're seeing in production, how much of your traffic is going one way or another. It could be several things. And then there's also channels. For a company like Tabcorp, you would have the digital channel. You also can place bets over the phone on the race course. How are you going to simulate all of that? I mean, that's something that you need to work out in your workload model.
Absolutely. Henrik?
Yeah, I think that the biggest thing that is not done properly today is workload modeling. I mean, remember, performance testing is a simulation. So if you do the wrong simulation, you will probably spend, I don't know, if you do it, let's say half an hour test, you're spending time to build scenarios, you're spending time to set in place the monitoring, you're spending time to analyze, you're detecting things, you are making the right decisions, you're so invested in your project, and then suddenly you move on to production and there's a big disaster. And then someone in the organization would say, we're not going to do load performance testing anymore because it doesn't reflect real life. Okay, so I think the problem is not we are not going to do because it reflects real life. It's more about what did we achieve to make that test not accurate. So I think, yeah, understanding the context, like Stephen mentioned, is crucial. And I think we have so many data around us today. We are rich of data. How to say? There is the tracking systems that a lot of companies, marketing teams are putting up. So Google Analytics or Adobe or whatever. Those provide you a lot of understanding on how the system has been utilized. You can collect the data, build the right workload model out of that, or you can also use APM product we mentioned about a real user monitoring, understanding how the user is basically doing, when, where, all that type of things. You need to have those questions. So what is the constraint of the user? What is the network conditions? What is the device? Which geographical locations? How is the rhythm as well? Don't underestimate that piece. If the user is taking their time on the website and they're not hurrying up to do everything in 2 seconds, like a robot, like a script, maybe the load that you apply to the system won't be reflecting real life. Having slower user may impact more your application because they're staying longer on the website. So it means, technically, it means that their session is staying longer. So at the end, it will be more concurrent sessions, more memory, more things that is consumed on your architecture. So everything is crucial to have a realistic load test. And this is, for me, it's the most important part. Understanding the app, understanding how the users are interacting with your system, the pace of the users, everything it needs to be considered. So then you can have the right tests and selecting the right tests as well, because there are different type of situation that you can observe in production. Maybe a situation in early morning when everyone connects when they arrive in your office. There could be a situation. There are various spikes in the day that needs to be tested. So I think, yeah, using the data that we have around us to understand how our system is used and how it's been utilized, so then I can make the right simulation out of that. That's is the key concept. Otherwise, you will have people saying in your organization, say, "Hey, load performance doesn't make sense." So yeah, let's make sure that we don't have that message anymore.
Thanks, Henrik. I want to cross to Paul in a moment, but first I just want to give a shout out to his awesome YouTube channel. I'll get him to link that in chat when he gets a chance, but he covers off some great things around, adding noise to performance testing and things like that. And I think that's very in tone with what we're talking about right now. So Paul, what's involved in creating a good performance test?
Well, so imagine if you was trying to simulate something with 10 transactions per second, right? That's not a huge volume, but a decent volume. Did you know that in real life, if the average is 10 per second, you'll have some seconds in 1 hour that are about 21 transactions, statistically, if it's pure random. So with that in mind, just statistically, you have a lot of variation from second to second. You might have some seconds with almost none and some seconds with double or more than double. If you had 100 hours of testing, you'll have some with nearly 3 times the number. So, and if you look at 2 or 3 consecutive seconds, you'll have some big spikes. So the response times then can be severely affected by those little spikes. So what I like to do is I like to make it more realistic, use more users rather than less. In the internet, there are millions of users. So you can't necessarily afford millions of users. But if your target testing could be done with 1,000 users, it can probably be better done with 2,000. So use as many virtual users as you can. I know that the licensing model for some systems makes that, attaches a cost to that, but still it is better to use more users. So that's the easiest thing. The second thing for making a test more realistic is making sure you use different and realistic data. So names and addresses should be sensible and reasonable. If you use a small set of names, like surnames, then the databases will all be skewed if names are searched. If emails are important, the emails should be set up so that you have a nice distribution of letters in the first few characters of emails, so the index for them is appropriately unskewed. So basically, it's important that the data is realistic, and that the relationships between the data is realistic. So let's imagine you're a telephone company and most people have 2 telephones. That's great. But what happens if a few customers have 1,000 telephones? Well, when they go to update their account, they will load in 1,000 phones, right? So if your data has everyone with the average number of phones on their account of 2, you're not going to catch those occasions where someone logs in and has 1,000 phones. But the thing is, if you have 1,000 phones, you're going to log in a lot of times to access those 1,000 phones and do updates. So it's not going to, the proportion of activity against that skewed account is going to be disproportionate. So I would say from a reliability point of view of the test being reasonable, you need to have statistical variation in there with spikes, and you need to have realistic test data with the right mix of relationships between the data as well.
Thanks for that, Paul. You know, one of the things that I often get challenged with performance testing, and I think there's still a lot of culprits today in the industry, is this idea that performance testing is a sort of, for many companies still today, a segregated sort of team, a performance team as such, that basically, you know, an agile team will basically consult with and say, you know, we've got this new feature, we're going to release it in 2 weeks. Can you performance test it for me? And then, you know, they'll maybe get a cross or a tick, and they might get a bit of an idea of what went wrong. But maybe there's a bit of a lack of understanding about what's actually caused the performance issue, because sometimes these teams are so segregated, you know, that understandably don't have internal knowledge of the system. And so they can't really pinpoint often where the actual performance problem is in the code that needs to be fixed in order to overcome the performance issue. I'm curious how some of our panelists are dealing with that today, and thoughts on that as well. I'm going to start with Stephen.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, because to be really confident in performance testing or in engineering, like, it took me 5 years of dedicating my entire career to it, really, to get good confidence to be able to tackle most situations. And so just to expect an agile team to have that level of skill, it's difficult. I think the model we're trying at the moment is we do have a centralized team, but we're a team that's designed to enable other teams to do as much performance testing and analysis and monitoring themselves as possible. And so we build frameworks and infrastructure to help them do that as easily as possible. But, you know, to be honest, a lot of the time we end up having to do quite a lot of hands-on work still. But that's the goal, to try and shift as much possible into the teams. And that gets them excited. It's an interesting new thing to get involved in. And also, I think it builds accountability. So, wow, I just delivered this feature and it performs terribly. Oh, that's not good enough, and fixing it, as opposed to just waiting till the end when someone else tells them it's a problem.
Absolutely. Dylan, you know, I'm curious to cross to you on this one around sort of monitoring as well. Obviously, we're seeing a lot of things coming out now, tooling that helps us monitor. Some people in the industry are almost, you know, coming to the point that they're saying these tools could replace performance testing as we know it. I'm curious your thoughts on these tools.
I have mixed feelings about kind of all of the things that have just been discussed. I don't think individual purpose tools are ever going away, because I think they all serve a purpose, and you need to know what you're doing with all of them anyway. But why I have mixed feelings, and this goes back to workflow modeling and about realism as well, and monitoring, is like, so the way that with Source that performance testing works is you just turn a flag on, you run your normal functional tests, or you run Selenium tests. I assume they're functional because most of them are. We capture the metrics and then we do a statistical analysis on them. Like Paul was mentioning that like things aren't even, they come in interesting distributions, and there's apparently some machine learning magic in there. And we basically go, this is what your page should look like. And I kind of hate that as a model, because all it does is it tells you what is currently the case. But it does mean you can measure shifts, like how things are getting worse and how things are getting better. And it's kind of like a real workload because it's a functional test. Theoretically, your users are doing the things in your functional test that they're doing in real life, except that I also know that they're not, because good functional tests generally are like log in, add an item to your cart, and nobody is building their 50 cart Christmas wish list in their functional tests. They're just checking you can add one thing to your cart. So you've got this one world where everything sounds reasonable and is easy and kind of gives you good feedback on that comes out of what you're already doing. And then this other part where actually all the things you're already doing aren't really user-based. They're not real. They're very synthetic in a lot of ways. And so I've been thinking about this and thinking about automation, because like you, I really like to play with automated tools and build cool systems. And kind of the conclusion that I came to personally is that you should definitely keep monitoring whatever you can. Any data you can get is useful data, as long as it's not all mixed together, because if you decide it's not useful data, you can just ignore it. But I've been thinking the best way to do it is to take your functional tests and your bugs and smash them together. Because bugs are things that your users actually encountered. Functional tests are what you want your users to want to do. And so in the middle there should be reasonable use cases. That's where you get the customers with the 1,000 telephones that Paul was talking about. And that's where you get the, I gave up because I hate your site. Which I guess that doesn't really answer the question on tooling all that well. Because yeah, I don't care what tools people use. I want people to use tools that give them the outcomes they want. And that depends on what you're doing already.
Agreed, Dylan. Well, it cuts right into a beautiful question from one of our attendees, JT. With everyone believing JMeter is the best tool for all these integration and early tests, what do you think about commercial tools like NeoLoad, LoadRunner, etc.? I'm going to cross over to Nicole for that one.
So I think that this is one of the most common questions that I get asked. And I think that's because it's like the first concrete thing, like downloading a tool. But I'm pretty tool agnostic. I'm agnostic about a lot of things actually, but I don't think it should matter what tool you use. You use the best one for your team. If your team already has experience with a scripting language or a framework, use that. And take into account things like budget as well, and whether or not you already have existing scripts that you could reuse. I don't think, unfortunately, there is a one best testing tool that fits for everybody.
Agreed. Paul, your thoughts?
Well, I imagine my thoughts were very similar to Henrik's, but he will obviously talk about his software. I've been a LoadRunner user since 1999. It was called XRunner way back then. And I think there's a lot of value in a commercial tool. I think the support you get from a commercial tool is great. The license limitations can be a problem. The cost is obviously a problem. But when it comes down to it, it's not necessarily what the tool will do. It's more how efficient is the workflow that the tool supports. How confident can you be in the QA process of the commercial organization that's built the tool? Open source is great. And I'm playing with various open source load testing tools as well. And some tools like LoadRunner are now supporting integration with Gatling and JMeter, and you can incorporate them in your tests now, often with unlimited numbers of users for free, which is great. But I think the main benefit of commercial tools is a sense of confidence in them, but the workflow, it can be very easy to go from 0 to full speed in a very short amount of time with a minimal amount of effort in between each iteration. That's my personal opinion. I know it's not everyone's.
Thanks, Paul. And that's a good point. I mean, obviously, Henrik, you work for Neotis. You know, they're behind one of the largest, most successful commercial tools in NeoLoad. I'm curious for your perspective.
Of course, I would say NeoLoad is the best tool of the market, but I don't know. I don't know if anyone will will say that I will bring value in that question. No, I think there is clearly it really depends of your own uh, uh, requirements and objective within your project, within your own project. If you're a small company that you don't have thousands of team doing day-to-day basic testing, and you don't, and also you're testing, I don't know, just fire a few APIs, maybe your requirements will be different from an organization that need to test traditional website, SAP, MQTT, IoT. So it really depends which environment you're working, which technology you're dealing with. Tools are just tools. Again, you don't, do you ask a question, go buying in a car, say, hey, I'd like to buy a Ferrari, but what about a Dacia from Renault? Is it equivalent? I mean, gosh, there is you don't use a Ferrari the same way that you use a Renault. There are obviously there are some expectation behind both cars. So I think it's the same thing. So depending on your project, your technology, the way you're delivering, your expectation will be different. So I think JMeter has great things. LoadRunner was also pretty good, of course. Now I think LoadRunner didn't follow all the latest technology, but still it's a great tool. It's been a great tool since 25 years. And I think, of course, NeoLoad is just an amazing tool. But yeah, I think, again, don't just think about there is one tool that would do everything. Maybe depending on your constraints, one of the tools will make sense, and the others won't would bring less value. So you have to understand what your expectations, and then you can pick the right tool.
Thanks, Henrik.
Henrik, can I ask a quick question? So it used to be you could get NeoLoad with the community edition. Has that stopped now?
So there's been a slight change on this. So we are still providing the community editions for partners. So those licenses are there on and on and on. For traditional customers, we have stopped. We're keeping the 32 license evaluation because basically it was just bringing disruptions for us and doesn't bring much value. So we said, okay, yeah, let's remove the community editions if it doesn't get us anywhere else. Let's be more smart on how we want to attract the market, whatever it is. Because basically, community edition is a way of attracting the market to your tool. But yeah, I think evaluating the product 30 days is fair enough. And I think when you're evaluating the product, you don't need millions of users. You need a few users for that. That's fair enough.
I'd just like to add, if you have a commercial solution or you choose a commercial solution, it can be really helpful to see if they have a customer satisfaction team and lean heavily on them. It's something I've done in my job, and it's been great. It's great to have somebody from the vendor you use helping you use the product, and they can help you sell internally the value you're getting from it. So if you really like a tool and you really need somebody in your corner, you're paying the money, go use it.
Thanks, Dylan. I want to wrap up. We've only got about 5 more minutes before the conclusion and our prize draws and things like that. It's amazing how time flies. Just with a few things around implementing a good performance test. But we've had some incredible questions, a lot of questions actually throughout, and I think we can cover them a bit by answering some of these questions. So I want to start by crossing this one over to Stephen, and it's from Kathik. And he says, can we have performance testing in CI/CD without affecting the build times much? Thoughts?
I'm probably not the best person to answer. I think that trying to put performance testing into a CI pipeline isn't necessarily the good thing to do. If you don't have a mature performance testing process and the really valuable tests, then all you're going to do is do lots of really bad tests a lot really quickly, which serves no purpose whatsoever. The goal should be to be managing, to identifying the performance of the application and preventing business risk from happening, right? So do that in any way possible. So I'm actually a big proponent of running daily automated performance tests because that gives me enough time to run a long enough test to get meaningful results. I'm still tracking it every day. So I didn't really answer the question, but that's my views on the matter.
Does anyone have strong views on this one around CI/CD? Anyone done it?
I think. Go ahead. We'll add it.
Oh, sure. Who cares? Would probably be my answer. Like, put it in a separate pipeline, or do it in parallel, or run it after your pipeline. I'm a really big fan of staged pipelines, because once you've got past a certain part, you can just stop caring. Like, oh, cool, the unit test's passed. Commit, go do something else, get a coffee, come back when it's done. Yeah, so it can drive up the pipeline time unless you parallelize, which is a good general solution.
I think it really depends, of course, of if you do putting on a pipeline and you want to move on to the next stage. Obviously, the duration of the test will depend. I mean, there are if you do pure regression testing between each build, then the duration of the test, of course, could depend, of course, on the system that you're testing. Don't run a 5-minute test again. Stephen just mentioned it, but at least few more minutes would be fair enough, because you need data to understand. But again, I think what Dylan suggested, doing parallel makes sense. But I think depending on where you are, if you're dev, if you're running a build on daily basis and you have a validation going through performance, it takes 5-10 minutes, 10 minutes to say, it's not a big deal. Then if the dev is positive, then you take your application, you promote it to the next stage, and maybe you move on to staging, and maybe the test that you will achieve in staging will be longer or different. You won't test the same thing. So it really depends of where you are, in which stage of the project lifecycle you're implementing your automation. But again, I think the key thing we've discussed here from the beginning is understanding the context in the app, so then you can implement the right tests, especially when you start to do the CI/CD approach. Don't do CI/CD because it's popular on the market. It's been recommended. Think about what you will have to do if you want to automate.
Thanks, Henrik. One of the JT actually just made a good point in chat as well. JMeter plugin and Dynatrace signature plugin helps with this, for anyone listening. One of the other key things I think with performance engineering we all talk about, especially when we see performance engineering in person, is data. And I really want to hit up Paul on this before we wrap up in 2 or 3 minutes. How important is data and implementing a good performance test?
Well, that's a great question. It's one of my favorite questions. Thanks for asking. So most of the systems we test are there because of a population of users. The app is developed to service the requirements of a bunch of users. And to do that, I think we should have a population of identities that we test against. And the traditional way is that you write your scripts and you embed in the scripts a CSV file, or you reference a CSV file or a data source that is tightly coupled to the script. And the problem with that is you are defining the way that data is, instead of in real life, in production, you're exposed to a population of users. So my thought is you should test your systems with a population of identities that you don't control. On an on-demand basis, you fetch me a random person, please. Give me their details, and let's feed that into the script, and let's go from there. And then you'll find all of the weird things with addresses that don't quite fit, and someone who doesn't have it. Did you know people don't have to have a day of birth? They might only have a month and a year of birth, and that's actually legit. And it might even be on their license. But how many times have you noticed that or done that in your functional tests? And what happens if when you do that, it causes a nasty problem, which has a performance impact? So all that sort of stuff is important. So I love using real data. I love using millions of identities, and I love extending that out to attributes like email addresses and hardware tokens of those identities. So I love test data. And it's really crucial to doing a decent test.
Thanks, Paul. Well, looking at the time, my God, we're almost out of it. So I just want to do a summary. Obviously, first and foremost, thanks to our incredible performance engineers, panelists. They're all incredible, and they've all been incredible in the lead up to this event as well. Super supportive, on board, coming to our little practice event where we just kind of discuss our themes and what we want to actually discuss. So first and foremost, just thanks to you guys. You're amazing today. Before we conclude testing talks and announce our prize winners, I also just want to do a final thank you to our partners. Our partners are aligned in the testing talks vision that our community deserve more fun days in the calendar to learn, share, and have fun. So thanks again to Neotis, Source Labs, Headspin, and Shri. Many of you might have heard of our partners. Neotis develops a software testing tool, as you heard about today, designed to improve the quality and performance of information systems. Neotis's primary product, NeoLoad, is the most automated performance testing platform for enterprise organizations continually testing from APIs to applications. NeoLoad. Source Labs is a leading provider of continuous testing solutions that deliver digital confidence. With the Source Labs Continuous Testing Cloud, you can be confident that your web and mobile apps will look, function, and perform exactly as they should on every browser, OS, and device every single time. Headspin is a platform to take your mobile experience to the next level. What amazed me as a tester is how the Headspin platform gives its customers access to thousands of real devices and endpoints across 100 locations in more than 70 countries around the world, allowing customers to test their software manually or with automations on these devices. Shri is a leading international staffing company. Shri provides specialist contract and permanent recruitment services in the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics sector. Shri's purpose is to bring skilled people together to build the future. So you might have seen me turning my head left a few times in the last 5 minutes. I was just going through all the survey results. Thank you so much to everyone that submitted the survey. We had over 85 people submit the survey, which is incredible. Unfortunately, we had 5 people that either scored a 14 out of 15 or a 13 out of 15, which is very impressive. I was joking that one of the tough questions was definitely from Headspin about where one of their device farms wasn't located and that it was Greece. Pretty sure you would have had to scale the web pretty far to find that answer. So if you got that one right, congratulations. The prize winners are, so Vijaya Pondala, congratulations, you've won a $200 Amazon gift card, and we'll be in contact with you after the event. Gary Smith, congratulations, mate. You've won the AirPods with the charging case. Arun, you've won a $200 JB Hi-Fi gift card, and we'll be in contact with you after the event. Jay, Jay, thanks so much for submitting all your great feedback and questions throughout the event. You've also done phenomenally well on the survey, and you've won yourself the drone, which is very exciting. Panelist Nicole was saying before, it's actually a really cool drone, which is good feedback. And then finally, Nitesh Jain, congratulations, you've won the Pioneer headphones. That is the only prize we actually have physically, and you can see it behind me over there. So I'll send that out personally once I get your address details. As for the other sort of prize drawers from Headspin and Source Labs, you'll hear from our partners on that, and they'll actually deliver that $100 gift card, and the Source Labs swag will come out one by one. So just to wrap up, I hope you enjoyed Testing Talks Online. Please let us know via the website, LinkedIn. Feel free to add up all of us on LinkedIn if you don't already have us. If you have any further questions that didn't get answered today, hopefully you can see the passion in all our voices and the sort of fire in our eyes for how much we love doing this stuff. And I'm going to keep doing it, and I can't wait to do it in person again, where we can bring conferences together and play all those crazy games and give away all those prizes and have swag for days again. So thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you soon.